the first time your brain ever lies to you is the second time you open your eyes.
Donald Hoffman talks about like evolution evolving for fitness and not vertical truth. And he says if any organism was trying to optimize for vertical truth, it would basically go extinct immediately. And so what we're left with is a bunch of things that are all lying about the environment to themselves in order to fulfill a homeostatic purpose. I think in a spectrum of a population of humans, it's actually a feature to have, some amount of neurodivergence and to have different ways of looking at the world. I don't know there's a right way to look at the world.
I see a future with AI scaling expertise like that. So imagine you're an enterprise, you want to get Seam Land's expertise, like you're 100 different businesses that want to maybe get his expertise, I don't know, flowing into your organization for your employees' well-being or whatever. What if he just had an agent that could do that work for you? Hey everybody, welcome to the ABCs for Building the Future podcast. My name's Robert. I am joined today by my co-host and co-founder of Epistemic Me, Jonathan. Today we're going to chat a little bit about consciousness, philosophy, and AI. And then we're going to get into a build in public update. Jonathan and I are going to go over an exciting product release that is impending for the Epistemic Me team called the SDK Playground, oriented towards developers to come to our website to check out our product, to get familiar with the data model, and easily bootstrap a hyper-personalized agent and be able to simulate dialectics and get awesome evals to make it better. So with that said, Jonathan and I recently went to the Vitalis Bay Summit, and Jonathan actually got to talk to one of the speakers, Patrick House, who is doing work in the field at Stanford. And he got wind that Patrick House has actually released a book. And because we've been on kind of a consciousness tailwind, Jonathan and I just started reading it. And we've gotten through a few chapters. So, because a lot of what we're doing is building and implementing these concepts of, within cognitive science, neuroscience, consciousness into reality to solve AI alignment and improve chatbot development, we thought it might be cool to talk a bit about his books and some of the themes he talks through. So then we can connect that a little bit to what we're building in Epistemic Me. So with that said, Patrick House's book is called 19 Ways of Looking at Consciousness. It's a collection of essays that explores consciousness from various perspectives using analogies and scientific insights. Maybe before we even get into it, Jonathan, because you're a big fan of the writing so far, and you told me something specifically, which was he's not like other academics, where he's an academic then a writer. He's like a writer and he's an academic. So do you want to give a quick flyby of what you think about the book and why you made that statement? And then we'll get into some of the discussion questions I put together.
Yeah, I think when I watched his presentation at Vitalis Bay, he had mentioned, being a writer, and I thought he was pretty like fluent and articulate. And sure enough, when you start reading this book, it's just like very well written. It's enjoyable to read. It has a lot of examples, metaphors, illustrative language, and does not seem like the type of book that's written by a scientist. So in the way that it engages, and so I thought this guy's a serious writer is one of my takeaways. Yeah, I've enjoyed the style of it. I think each of the 19 different ways is presented as kind of like, put yourselves in the shoes of somebody that could take on this point of view and make it advocate for this kind of this point of consciousness. But he actually, instead of putting forth a single scientific hypothesis of what consciousness is, he does the opposite, and he said it could be like all these things. And I thought that's a really cool way to explore the topic. And yeah, the book's enjoyable through that lens.
Yeah. He has like a very yes and approach to it, right? Like he's
Yeah.
not trying to say there's only this one thing. It's like the spectrum and everything in between. So I'm 6-ish chapters into it. Have you finished it, Jonathan?
hmm Yeah, I
Okay,
read the book.
cool.
Yeah, I listened to a few of the chapters again today. Uh,
Sweet.
yeah, it's kind of it's one of those books you can read twice easily.
Yeah, it's really good. So we can get into some of the discussion questions, and then I have the book in front of me in my notes here, so I could read out some of the sections that I thought were interesting. Was there a chapter you were particularly interested in talking about of the first six, Jonathan, before I get into some of the questions I prepped.
Yeah, well, I think it was chapter six, right? I might have mentioned it before I even started reading the book. When I briefly met Patrick, we maybe talked for like 5 minutes or something like that at the VIP dinner, and I told him about Epistemic Me, and I usually describe it like, that we're making digital twins for people to utilize personal health, and it's based on a belief system model. And if the person is of a certain rigor or scientific rigor, I'll say it's the belief system is based on Carl Friston's free energy principle. Um,
Mhm.
and when I told him that, he said, "Oh, I wrote a book about consciousness, and I have a chapter called Secondhand Markov Blanket." And Markov blanket is a key principle in the free energy principle, and it's like a totally nerdy thing. Like I actually bought a blanket that's called the Markov blanket just because I was
Yeah.
like, this is so nerdy. And he similarly was making a pun, and he told me that it's like a unique sort of error in the book because he meant it like secondhand, as in like secondhand of a clock, secondhand Markov blanket, and it actually is a way to like how do we distinguish, the sort of like morpho or like the I guess the teleological changes of over a lifetime, like when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, being like a change in time.
Yeah.
Whereas the Markov blanket is usually thought of as a demarcation of a boundary system in space. So he kind of in this chapter six postulated that we need something like a Markov blanket that describes time in order to like really delineate where somebody a human being begins and ends and like what the boundaries of it are, which
Mhm.
I thought is a really cool idea. But yeah, he and then he shortly thereafter mentioned he was because I mentioned Annika Harris's book on Lights On, and he's like, yeah, she interviewed me in chapter four. I was like, cool. I wish I'd have also read that book. I didn't realize that he was the one, but that was the one about plants and parasites. And I think one of Patrick's really interesting ways of looking at a being is to consider like that we are an accumulation of all, do you consider a human being the accumulation of all the parasites and cells that its DNA defines also? I mean, could they coexist with and so he's got deep insights into this parasitic relationship that is, I think, misunderstood and like deeply interesting.
Yeah. Real quick context for the audience. So when Jonathan said he met Patrick House, the neuroscientist and writer in question, at the VIP dinner, this is an extension to the Vitalist Bay conference that we both attended. So that was the longevity conference. We had a different podcast where we debriefed on still more to honestly debrief from that one.
Yeah,
There was
it
a
was a good
lot
time.
there.
There's
That was a
lot
good
going on.
time. And we met some of the best minds in the industry and the space when it comes to working on these problems of consciousness, cognitive science, neuroscience, etc. And in particular, just reading this out. So for anybody that is interested in Patrick House's work, he focused on how mind control parasites altered behaviors in rats. Fascinating stuff. That's wait, what? We fund these things? That's so cool. What? So yeah, that obviously has layers of implications.
And you might not think that's that relevant, but actually, that's the parasite that's carried by cats, and it can
Mhm.
permeate through the human blood-brain barrier. It's the only parasite I think known to do that. So it's this highly adapted thing that it needs to it needs to reproduce in the cat's intestinal system, but they, kind of live in the nervous systems of other mammals that cats acquaint with.
Wait, zoom out a little bit and just let's just side quest, tell the audience about this. You went a little deep. Set some context for the cat parasite
Oh,
thing.
I didn't know if this is like a broadly known thing, but cats have this parasite. It's like toxoplasmia or something like that. And so, but, like a lot of people that have cats are exposed to it.
Yeah.
And it's actually a neural parasite, and it's so interesting because it's one of the few one of these things that can cross through your blood-brain barrier and then live in your brain.
For humans. Yeah. There are
Uh,
humans out there with this.
yeah, or say any mammal. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
That's why he
Yeah.
was studying rats. Like it's probably, like a proxy for whether or not humans are affected by this neural parasite.
Yeah. And in
Um,
particular, he like was studying the what he found was this parasite could change the behavior of rats and essentially could make them less fearful of cats, which they have a very natural emotional triggering and flooding that protects them from an evolutionary fitness function standpoint to be scared of cats. So that was a
right.
really interesting demonstrable thing where it's like, oh, we could change the wiring of this rat. Uh,
Yeah.
That is very interesting. So that was what his research found.
Pretty complex
uh,
adaptive strategy, right? Like for the cats, right? It
for sure.
to develop
For sure.
a yeah.
Yeah. So we have this question we always ask in the pod, which is how can AI understand us if we don't fully understand ourselves? And the more we get into consciousness, the science of consciousness, neuroscience, and stuff like that, or even hear about thought leaders, I find that is singularly like the question, which is why we're doing this work. So some of the themes in the book that I got so far, Jonathan's finished. I haven't, but it's that the brain lies to you by design. That was a really powerful
Mm.
thing that Patrick talked about. He said the first time your brain ever lies to you is the second time you open your eyes. And I was like, wow, that's so intriguing. That the thinking being when you first open your eyes, you have sensory input. You had nothing in your brain, your model didn't exist. And then now you exist, you open your eyes, you have the sensory input, you start constructing that model, and your brain is projecting these quote lies or what the world looks like around you based on that. So I thought that was a really powerful quote. The first time your brain lies to you is the second time you open your eyes. On that note, I know that you have mentioned there's another book I actually have next to me, being your favorite book, Jonathan.
Yeah, I like that one.
And yeah, and he talks about beast machines. So I thought, in particular, connecting these two topics, I'd love to hear what you think about that. Your brain lying to you, us projecting a model of the world, or our brains projecting a model of the world, connecting that to the concept of beast machines. And actually, let me just read the context setting part of that, because it was really great writing. In the mid 1990s, Anna, age 16, had brain surgery to alleviate suffering from epilepsy. Because the brain does not have pain receptors, she was allowed to remain awake the whole time with only a tiny amount of localized anesthetic to numb her scalp. During the procedure, the doctors and attendants asked Anna a series of questions meant to keep her talking. And as they probed her brain with electricity and micron thin blades, hoped that she would not stop. So that's what Jonathan meant, and tying that back to like your brain lies to you in that moment when her brain is opened up and she's undergoing the surgery. And during this, when the attendants were just asking her questions, trying to keep her alive, basically, they observed this phenomena where she was just laughing once they had electricity put into a certain spot in the brain. And then when asked why she was laughing, like Jonathan said, she just made up things. Like, I'm just reading this right now, but saying there's a horse around, that it's funny, and just saying everybody around her is funny in the room, and just like making things up. And she didn't receive general anesthesia. So it's really interesting for that particular case that demonstrates, like, oh, wow, in this very niche situation that you have not been in before, what does the brain say about it?
You know, it's a pretty complex behavior to arise from a simple like charge being applied to part of the brain. But then when they asked her why she was laughing, she never identified that it was like uncharacteristic of herself. She would say, "Oh, I was laughing because of like the movement of the nurse over there," or "I was laughing because I thought that pamphlet was funny," or something like that. She would make up a story. She basically like invent an explanation to describe the behavior that was happening, sort of like underneath in her subconscious. So that's I think a pretty good articulation of you know how we're all just trying to tell an explanatory story oftentimes of that would may explain something that we're doing without really a greater recognition of it. It might actually take us longer to understand why we're actually doing it. But that's the kind of lie I think that was pretty illustrative. What do you think of as an example of a lie that you tell yourself in the sense of
Yeah, I thought that was such a good example, right?
yeah, right.
And we basically just see a bunch of real life malfunctioning of the brain because it can't make sense of it, right? At least that was my
Yeah.
takeaway from reading the chapter. And I'm just sort of thinking about times when my brain was trying to make sense of something that was so foreign to me.
And you might
Yeah,
even have been aware, right?
yeah, seriously. I mean, I go back to when I nearly died, and I was full of adrenaline, so I didn't believe I was
Yeah.
nearly dead. I don't think my brain wanted me to believe I was nearly dead. I was like, "Yeah, I can still walk. I got this." And then I took a step and tripped, and that didn't
Mm.
work well. So I think my brain lied to me then about how much pain I was in, certainly. I think the
Yeah.
adrenaline helped with that, and that probably, honestly, looking back, kept me positive and in a good state to fight for life.
That's a really interesting example. because where the body's homeostatic systems are kicking in to like help you write a narrative that's constructive for the situation you're in.
Yeah, and what's interesting is like your narrative is always personal to you, right? What
Hmm.
matters, you're the hero in your own story, right? So there are many narratives that I could have had then. The one that I had was the one that I had that kept me going is that I'm the underdog and I'm gonna get out of this. With, of course, I'm gonna become stronger past this accident. I'm not gonna let this take me out. I still got my dreams to pursue. My brain, I think, in reviewing my life and going through a lot of therapy, is my brain likes being the underdog. So I think it really told me that narrative, and that shit kept me alive.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have anything that comes to mind when it comes to thinking about your brain lies to you.
Yeah, I think I don't know, maybe feelings of depression I feel like are
Mm,
lies, you know, and they skew
yeah,
in a way that like really things were more important in the current time, or you kind of pull the future in and make it like you could catastrophize it, and make it
yeah,
a bigger catastrophe than it is internally. And I think it's a misrepresentation of future reality for yourself, and I think
yeah.
yeah, and you can use tools like once you experience depression enough to say no, this happens farther out in time. There's more time to consider this. This isn't as big a catastrophe as you think it is. There's a lot of normalizing sort of that you can do to unwind the lie and make yourself feel more normal about the reality.
That is such a good one. When we have Bishoy back, let's talk to him about that, which is
Yeah.
mental disorders. Are these just lies that our brain tells us? After reading Brain Energy by Dr. Christopher Palmer, it
Mhm.
talks about how like mental disorders are really just symptoms of the root cause of metabolic disorders of the brain and accumulated toxins and stuff like that. Or I like that conceptualization that depression is your brain lying to you. That's pretty good. Next time I encounter it, I'll try to tell myself that because it's so interesting. I feel like I went through a micro depression recently, actually, because my brother was going through a hard time, and because of that, I was really stressed. And I was doing a root cause analysis actually today of like, how did I get into this micro depression, and then how do I make sure that I don't get into it next time, or if I do, recognize it faster and get out of it faster. Um, so I did a bit of a retro today. So it's funny that this came up, but I realized that when I feel a sense of loneliness in connections that matter to me, like the one with my brother, and if there's a threat to that connection, which then incites the loneliness, my brother's not doing well. He's going through a hard time mentally. And then I worry about him. And then he'll mess up like my sleep and my physiology, basically, like my health. That stress accumulates to that. And then it cycles into I don't sleep well. I don't get the autophagy or like restorative sleep benefits. And then the stress and those things accumulate. And then I'm less likely to be positive or have less of a my fire feels a little dampened. So
Right.
it is interesting because the brain operates from that place of scarcity. It's like, oh, you might lose your brother, and I think that's what I felt looking back. That is interesting. So how do you
Yeah. Yeah.
how do you find truth in those moments? I guess that's the question. It's hard.
Yeah. I think there is a lot of truth in the feeling too. I mean, we'll get to what veridical truth versus like useful truth is in a second, but I think that the feelings that you have when somebody close to you is in danger and you're worried about them are real, right? And then there's kind of like a layer beyond that about like how can we both address this issue and what's constructive about it that oftentimes your emotions hijack, you know,
Yeah.
and overplay a role versus a cognitive, planning mechanism.
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. Do you have more to say on that topic, which is like mental disorders or illnesses being kind of like your brain lying to you?
I don't know. We have this kind of term neurodivergence now, right? And I think in a spectrum of a population of humans, it's actually a feature to have, some amount of neurodivergence and to have different ways of looking at the world. And, I don't know there's a right way to look at the world. There's a way to look at the world that fills a fitness and adaptation function for
Mhm.
us as a group and for us individually and for
Mhm.
all our ancestral homeostatic functions. And that's kind of like what, you know, I think Harari talks about the first in shared fictions. that serve a purpose.
Mhm.
They're shared fictions. They're not shared vertical truths. Donald Hoffman talks about like evolution evolving for fitness and not vertical truth. And he says if any organism was trying to optimize for vertical truth, it would basically go extinct immediately. And so what we're left with is a bunch of things that are all lying about the environment to themselves in order to fulfill a homeostatic purpose. And then
Yeah,
you have Neil Sess with his beast machines, which, basically applies to the single metaphysical self. And it's a recapitulation of all the homeostatic processes in the body bubbling up to create a constraint that you have a controlled hallucination of self, which they calls that kind of his beast machine construct, and he uses Frisch's free energy principle to quantify that mathematically.
yeah, for sure. It's quite fascinating that the brain is just constantly trying to make sense of the world. And so when you're in these experiences like Anna was in that brain surgery experience, like your brain is essentially just trying to build a story, a narrative for you from this mess. And that could just be a
Yeah.
mess in itself. They in chapter one, he also had a really interesting citation where he mentioned, so he had that quote, the first time your brain lied to you was the second time you opened your eyes. He talks about how seeing is an experience-based inference performed effortlessly and expertly by the adult human brain. That's a quote from the book. And that makes sense. Like when you are an adult, you're out in the world, like just imagine getting out of bed and the amount of information, right, that you take in, even just getting out of bed. Like alarm clock goes off, your brain registers that that is a certain time that you needed to be up at. And then you need to actually go do a bunch of things, take the covers off, move your legs, like step on one of them, step on the other one, walk to the bathroom. Those are all things people just do, but they never think about it. But if you had to think about every one of those motor functions and all those things, it's like, shit, that's a lot. Like, so really our brains are designed to just help us be in motion towards how we need to actuate as best as possible. So basically it just filters a lot of things, right? So you get more signal than noise. So he had this other thing in there, which was cool. He said teenagers with cataracts, blind since birth. So teenagers that are blind since birth, upon opening their eyes after cataract surgery and seeing for the first time, experience featureless, depthless, shadowless blobs. They could see the same number of photons as an expertly seeing adult, but their brain sees nothing in the raw stream of light because their brains had never seen a coincidence before. That's so interesting. Like that was such an interesting. I didn't know about that, but that drives the point home that if you didn't feed data into the model before, it's blind. There's nothing there, right? Like quite literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example. I think, yeah, we all have the benefit of years of sensory data to train. And, like he talks a lot about movement characteristics and like these, that our neurons are sort of like preconditioned towards the movement patterns that we experience over our life, right?
Yeah.
And then I never thought that, perceiving light could be the same way. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense that identifying meaningful causal patterns and sensory like signals is not just a built-in thing, like it requires some training.
Yeah. It requires training for sure, just like foundation models.
Yeah.
um, cool. Do you want to talk about the pinball story a little bit? I love that story. That was probably my favorite so far, personally. What'd you think of that? I could give a quick recap as well of the pinball
Yeah.
story.
That was a cool metaphor. Yeah. A recap was
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. So chapter two was about the rise and fall of pinball. So anybody that has been to like a retro classic arcade, in-person arcade, has probably seen pinball machines, or maybe your local like dive bar has a pinball machine. I remember I played my first pinball machine back, I think it was Nickel City. There was this like arcade that branded as you get to play games with a nickel, and being a broke kid, that was the shit back then. So I was there all the time. And so it was interesting that I reading this essay, I had the experience of having played pinball in real life. And then also when, Windows PCs were more mainstream in the early 2000s and mid early 2000s, then it became a game you just get out of the box. So, okay, this chapter, Patrick House, he compares the evolution of the brain to the evolution of pinball machines. They're messy, they're janky, they're layered adaptations. stacked to older architectures. So his whole thing was a pinball machine started like this, then they added more and more features. It was a simple mechanical game, and then it went into, oh, now it's digital. Can we digitize everything? It used to be all analog. Can we create the same experience over here in the digital world, right? So the takeaway that I got looking at some of my notes is that consciousness is not a singular function, but it's an accumulation of legacy systems. And that's where like the data inputs and the model all blends everything together. Then I wonder, did we all standardize on a storytelling template just to speed up information flow? Did we all just adapt to the same storytelling structure just to maximize information flow? Is that
Yeah.
why that happened?
Are you talking about Joseph Campbell's monomyth?
What is that?
Oh, yeah, interesting. So Joseph Campbell, you love this guy. He he's the one who coined the hero's journey as a story
Oh,
archetype. And
okay.
so he had studied, like he was like an anthropologist or something like that. He studied storytelling through different cultures over time. He found that there was a common structure to them. He put them into what's called the hero's journey, and
Oh,
Star Wars was born, another
oh,
great. So he had a similar thesis that yes, there is in the inborn utility to a certain structure of narrative that helps
yeah.
us to pass on stories. Yeah.
Interesting. Wait, let me just read this out for everybody that was like me and uneducated about this, but has felt this or experienced this before. Joseph Campbell introduced the concept of the monomyth or the hero's journey in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, published in 1949. The monomyth is a narrative framework that describes a common pattern found in heroic tales across different cultures and historical periods. He posited that this pattern is universal and transcends cultural and regional differences, reflecting shared human experience. The hero's journey typically involves several stages, such as separation, initiation, return, where the hero ventures into a supernatural world, faces challenges, and returns with a boon or transformation that benefits their community. His work influenced numerous storytellers, like Star Wars, and has been applied to analyze various literary works and films. Interesting. Oh, and then I'm reading a part here. It's faced criticism from scholars, particularly folklorists, who argue that it suffers from source selection bias and oversimplifies the complexity of myths and stories. Critics suggest that the monomyth reduces the world to simple binaries and favors male protagonists, neglecting the nuances and diversity of narratives. Oh shit! I didn't know we were walking into
Mhm.
something like that.
Oh, the critical theory analysis of Joseph Campbell's work. Yeah. Um,
Interesting. Cool.
yeah. I mean, like most science from 1949 is going to
For
critique.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. But
And
I
there's
also
always
think,
going to be there's always going to be haters with everything, man.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay, but
the,
that's really interesting.
yeah, and I think you all know Harari's books. Like the
Yeah.
foundation of them basically kind of expands upon Campbell's work and talks
Okay.
about, the myth as the bonding feature of what humans are.
Oh, interesting. To bond across like cultures, like
Just yeah,
myth is
like
a
the
tool.
bonding force of a human culture is its storytelling, its mythology, its shared
I
fiction.
see.
So shared
I
fiction
see.
as something that can bond culture, and that's you probably heard Nietzsche's quote, "The God is dead." What do we
Yeah.
do? He was
Yeah.
really talking about, uh-oh, like our whole shared fiction was in this religion. When religion breaks down, we don't have a shared fiction anymore. What's going to happen next? And we've all been living that life since then, and all the cultural battles that come with it.
Somebody give me the next dogma. God damn it.
Right?
Here it is. It's don't die. Okay, so that was the pinball chapter. Let's spend a little bit of time on the next chapter and then we'll expound on this in future episodes. And then we'll get into the build and public update. The next chapter is about bird migrations. And that was interesting. It basically just talks about how there's this inherent gut instinct for a certain type of bird to go migrate. And that the theme that I remember from this is that the brain's ultimate purpose is like efficient movement to help you like actuate as an agent in the world. And then some of the topics touched on from that were around consciousness existing to model movement when actual movement isn't possible as well. yeah, I wrote a note here that from this chapter that all thinking is a simulation of movement. I'm kind of curious if you have any, reactions to that, or even just the overall concept that the brain's ultimate purpose is efficiency in movement.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about embodied cognition a few weeks ago, right? And
Yeah.
the so when you look at the evolution of animals in the brain, the nervous system, the basal ganglia was like the first structure of the centralized brain, and its entire purpose was basically to facilitate movement, coordination, amongst all these millions and billions of cells to actuate an environment for metabolic purposes, for fight or flight, you know, and so what the basal ganglia's basic function does, and you can imagine basal ganglia as like your spine, going up to the brainstem, the oldest part of your brain. And it has, it's just kind of aggregating all these nervous system inputs and efferent, afferent aspects of the nervous system is aggregating them. And it's actively predicting, like how the organism should move next. And so that's the base of cognition. And, like I think if you think of everything else working on top of the basal ganglia in terms of functionality, the basal ganglia is itself, you know, trying to predict the world in ways that are built on habituated patterns of movement and habituated patterns of cause and effect in the world. And it can be entrained to do that. Yeah. And so everything else we have just kind of like works on top of that from an evolutionary perspective.
And so, just to explain the whole bird migration thing, I'll read a few sentences from the chapter. He creates this metaphor of saying that we all biological species, creatures, organisms have some sort of migration anxiety for actuating. That's how all of us kind of work. So, he, in a simplistic view, so he talked about this from the book. A friend of mine, a bird watcher, once told me that the best time to search for birds is right after a storm because the grounded ones are very anxious to get going again. He called it Zugunru. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it. It's a German term. I'll throw the word link into the show notes. Zugunru. I'm going to say that for now. Our German viewers, please don't hate me. I'll correct myself after this pod. And translated it roughly, perhaps poetically, as the anxiety felt by migratory birds prevented from migrating. A body, too, Patrick says, is restless to get moving. In fact, the entire purpose of the brain is to make efficient movement from experience, and everything else, including consciousness, is downstream of these efforts. So, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And in particular, when I read this, I was like, man, this guy is a writer. I had just read the pinball one, and I'm like, what is this? It's so different than the other consciousness work that I've read. And then I got into this. I'm like, man, dude's talking about, bird migrations coming out of pinball history. And it's all good. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I had learned a new word. I never knew that word. Yeah, did you have more to add? Like what was your reaction reading about the migration anxiety concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very illustrative. I guess how I would say it's just a great way to talk about. Because again, this is chapter is just like another way to look at consciousness. You think
Yeah,
about the birds, point of view and like what they're trying to accomplish, and these kind of embedded movements that they're supposed to express. Like that's I didn't know about that before reading the chapter. It's really interesting,
yeah,
and it's just like a really interesting way to think about the embedded biases or like inherited characteristics that like this kind of consciousness carries with it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I I have read and thought more about the nervous system and like where he talks about it, 1/10 of a second response time to the world.
Mm,
So that's 100 milliseconds, right? And it's interesting, like the fastest a trained sprinter can respond to the start gun at a race is 100 milliseconds.
yeah,
So like any organism body, like to just kind of take all the inputs from the nervous system and then respond with a whole body movement, even in trained, even habituated. I think it takes an untrained sprinter maybe like 150 to 200 milliseconds to respond. But yeah, that's it's interesting to think about that because that's really kind of slow, right? The time it takes for like an impulse to get from your neck to your head is about 14 milliseconds, and you can turn your head given a large sound a little bit faster than you can actuate the entire body. So you think about all the sensory organs coming from the tip of your fingers, the tip of your toes, through your nervous system, being processed by your basal ganglia, and then actuated into the environment. Yeah, there's a lot going on there, and 100 milliseconds is pretty impressive. So
For sure. We all have these models that are constantly being updated that help us make sense of the world. Because otherwise, there'd be way too much information to process, right? Like literally just too much data to process. So, yeah, they made a tie back to Anna from chapter one in this chapter about birds to accentuate the point of consciousness being useful for movement. He had this one paragraph I really liked that I wrote down and noted down. In a sense, all movements give away their owner's secrets. Consider the simple act of laughing without reason. When Anna, a teenage girl suffering from epilepsy, underwent surgery to remove the part of her brain that caused her seizures, she laughed after a surgeon stimulated a certain part of her brain. But why did the surgeon pulling a single puppet string there in her brain create a whole cascade of muscle activity and emotions? How did one burst of current create so much activity? In part, this was because some actions are so precise and so rote, walking, laughing, that when the brain activates the patterns of muscular activity, the whole thing goes off at once, like a sprung mousetrap. Isn't that interesting? And actually, the next part is interesting too. But we can go back further too. The timing of her laugh all started in her mother's womb before any of Anna's neurons had matched to their destination, and when all her muscle cells had a natural pulse of about 10 times per second. At that time, all muscles would fire together, coupled electrically like rhythmic fireflies. When these muscles later started connecting to nerve cells, two things happened. First, the nerves brought the timing of the natural muscle rhythm into the brain, encoding the timing of these pulses, 10 times per second or 10 hertz, as a sacrosanct feature of interacting with the world. Second, the muscles, now freed by their attached puppet strings, could move independently and start to learn. Then the brain kicked in, its only job to reduce the metabolic expense of any and all of Anna's present or future movements. Her brain fed off the statistical regularity of observation, prediction, and action because the only output from all of its work are cells in charge of telling her muscles when to move. That's so interesting. And yeah,
that's so cool.
that's where that 10 hertz thing came from. I started realizing like we all just have refresh rates for our different sensories, you know. Uh-huh. And it's
Yeah.
all just data, right? Like how something tastes, how something sounds, like for races, for example, using that gun, like Jonathan said. But I thought that was a really cool analogy too of, oh, there are puppet strings here. And they're really
Mhm.
complex puppet strings that are created from your brain learning about the world and adapting to the world, right? So like when this thing happens, orchestrate all these puppet strings in a certain sequence that and then here you're laughing now while we tickle this part of your brain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's kind of a wild articulation of the embryonic process, right? Where,
yeah.
you know, we're born into this situation where all these pieces are pretty well assembled, and already, and then like by the time we're an adult, like they're even better assembled. But you talk about the puppet strings, and like our prefrontal cortex doesn't finish development and put all of its puppet strings into place until we're like 27 years old, and
Mm,
so like they talked about a phase where the muscles were contracting together without the nerves. You have the endoderm, the ectoderm, and the mesoderm. I think the muscles are in the mesoderm, and layered on top of that is the ectoderm, which has your skin, and then a fourth layer that forks out of it called our nervous system.
mm,
And so all of those like they evolve according to or we recapitulate them, or like their homeostatic functions at least in our embryo, in the order that they sort of like adapted and evolved over time. And so the
mm,
more
mhm,
complex neural instrument that our embryonic process is laying down to have puppet strings, the more advanced sort of like evolutionary functionality we can integrate, like these higher levels of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex. When we talk about what consciousness is, like it's just this. I mean, at least I picture it as a continuation of this embryonic process where we're conscious the whole time, but the more these layers of adaptations layer themselves on and make themselves available to us, the richer our felt experience gets. Um, and that's what it is to feel like a certain thing is just recapitulating all of these homeostatic processes on one on top of another, and our ability to constrain and tell stories about reality is constrained to what's happening at all these layers at the same time. It's constantly
Mhm.
ongoing.
Yeah.
I think you can think about how AI is like integrated into the human embryonic process to some degree in this way. Yeah,
Say,
as I think
say
about what
more about that. Say more about that.
well,
What do you mean?
like from like a teleological perspective, and like how do we change over time? Our embryonic process of making decisions like where does the next stem cell differentiate itself? Like where do I put the next stem cell? What is it going to turn into? Is it going to be like a new brain cell or something like this? And if we just see continued like growth as a human is continued evolution, like it could be that we have an adaptation of the higher levels of our nervous system that then are like built to receive connections from silicon wires, so you could see synthetic biological or genetically engineered like types of humans that like are extending the embryonic process specifically to afford adapters to an extended nervous system through like an LLM type of interface or something like that. Where does it's sort of like a transhumanist way, where do we look at like the next field of adaptations that the humans can
Yeah.
take on? You could put them a
Yeah.
lot of places, but I think like the most suitable in the highest cognitive, articulation of our stem cells in the prefrontal neocortex cortex. And yeah, I don't know. It's one way to look at like how AI and humans evolve.
Yeah. I mean, like, even one example I'm thinking of a tool that's starting to make it to mass market is the Warby Parker, like AI meta lenses or whatever.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, I mean, and then there's developers vibe coding, right? I mean, so in these ways, we have like developers vibe coding. You could argue there's another lens there of like, how do I work with this thing to do my job, right? And then on the Meta Ray-Ban side, it's like, oh, this is like visual sensory integration in everyday life, not just in a vertical like my job. And I bet those humans will have a very different looking brain than a human that doesn't put on like those Ray-Bans ever, right? In 30 years. I'm sure. I'm sure.
Yeah,
um,
but you can think about
yeah.
like that sensory interface, through the Ray-Bans or Apple's,
Yeah.
VR headset because it measures your focal lengths at like 4 milliseconds or something like that. And so if you could meet that sensory perception with an actual nervous system connection that could like integrate into the sensory loop of our sense making on an ongoing basis, there's like sort of there's a hybrid human in our future that would have like a supreme competitive advantage in a lot of different areas by co-evolving the embryonic process along with like where you meet in the current technology and the sensory organs.
That sounds scary when you put it that way. We're gonna have this superior human thing. But I mean, you're totally right. I think the future is full of cyborgs. I'll become a cyborg at some point. It's gotta
Yeah,
equip.
that's Levin's latest paper actually is like the multitude of different intelligences that we can expect given the advances in AI, synthetic biology, and genetic engineering.
Let's talk about that in a future pod, actually. So if anybody in the audience wants to hear about me and Jonathan talking about the future of intelligences and stuff like that, based on Michael Levin's paper and reacting to it, throw us your comments in the chat if you're curious. And also, while I'm plugging this in, for the audience, we read every comment. So if you have additional things you have questions on or topics you want to hear from us, please throw those in the comments or reach out. Go to our website. Okay, so we've been going for about an hour on consciousness. I think we should switch now. We could talk about this forever. I'll before I switch, I'll leave it on a quote from Patrick House, and please, everybody, go check out the book. Really great book. We'll continue talking about the different chapters, different lenses on consciousness in future podcast episodes. I thought this was cool quote. Any act of thinking is just pretending to act out. Consciousness requires cells that want to move and that know roughly what will happen when they do, but are prevented from doing so. Just as drinking coffee is just running in place, as a mammalian inhale is just moving some cells forward in order to push air along a membrane while standing still, as modern mammalian reproduction is just the process of laying and fertilizing eggs in a makeshift ocean. Also, while still so too, is thinking just moving without motion. Consciousness is the consequence of the primitive irritability of single cells that all share the ability to be impinged on, to be excited, or to be provoked. Go read the book. Really good. Okay, so for the build in public update today, Jonathan, do you want to give a quick overview of what we've been working on for Epistemic Me with the SDK Playground, some of our goals there, and then let's get into building in public.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's see. We synthesized a lot of ideas around the SDK Playground into a design prototype. We've been using Lovable for this, and it's been like a great multiplayer building experience. I think we can screen share that in a moment. And then I've also been prototyping the back end of how we can integrate the SDK Playground into an existing agent. And this one shows an agent built on AWS Bedrock. And yeah, so what we're basically doing is taking the agent and then creating a simulated user using Epistemic Me, and then we have we create a conversation between the simulated user and the agent. We pass the result of the conversations into a data set. This data set is evaluated by an evaluation tool and then scored with some feedback and explanation about like why it didn't pass. After that, you can update the agent, and we give ways, we're experimenting with ways, I should say, that we can sort of auto suggest improvements that can be updated and then redeploy the agent. So yeah, should we jump in and show maybe the dashboard we've been working on?
Yeah, let's just go straight to the punchline, and then we can walk back some of the thinking and then do some additional build in public design thinking to evolve it.
Cool. I'll get it pulled up here.
Also, a huge
Do you
shout
have
out
do you have it
to,
open right now?
oh, yeah, yeah, I do. I could share my screen. Great. So this is our working front end prototype for the SDK Playground. The SDK Playground is oriented towards developers who are interested in building highly capable, highly personalized AI agents, and for anybody that's interested in using Epistemic Me to enrich their existing user data so that you could personalize your application experience or agent experience for your users. We solve the persistent identity problem in AI right now, and we're going after AI alignment. So here's the SK Playground. You should be able to come here and create and bootstrap your agent, and underlying that, a self model. It's an epistemic me concept that powers it. You should also be able to create synthetic data for training that agent and then doing evals for that, and then exporting this data back to your application. Jonathan, do you want to help me drive a little bit? Where do you think we just start with create agent?
Yeah. Can you expand the left-hand sidebar with the I'm wondering if you're not in an older version than we've most recently updated.
Oh, like this
Yeah,
is older?
I think so, because mine looks different.
Oh,
Uh,
wait, I could just refresh my screen. Wait. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go.
oh yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. All right. Some deployment issue. There we go. All right. So we have, I guess there's three things. Actually, you were about to go into it. Do you want to talk about it a little bit?
Sure,
These
if
three
you want
items?
to open up the dialectic trainer, I think that's a good starting point because that's really, what it's all about. And then I think it's on the evaluation playground, start evaluation. Right. And here we have like a data set of different conversations. And what Robert just clicked on is a set of conversations. It says it's just 5 turns. So this is a synthetic user talking to an agent. And what it's doing is it's annotating each the conversation as a whole. You can see at the top, like with the sort of spider web visualization, and then the submetrics with their actual score. Those are actually it's actually like just two different visualizations of the same information. But those let's see, those metrics are our personalization metrics. So we're testing to see, does the agent understand who the user is in terms of identification? Do they understand how the user verifies beliefs? Do they understand how the user is learning? Uh, are they clear on the questions to ask? Do they know how to believe evidence beliefs, and ambiguity and prediction are the answer prediction are the other two. So there's a set of heuristics that apply to really helping the user evolve their belief system. And I think this is best suited for scenarios where, while obviously there's a lot of personalization needed, but also towards something where somebody's trying to learn. And I think, Robert, you had pulled out some of the cases with the Don't Die AI Brian that early
Yeah.
test users had.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think those kind of intents, say a user seeking to understand, how a certain medication works or how a supplement might work,
Mhm.
might be an area where they're looking to verify a belief that they have, or maybe update their beliefs. And we're looking at, okay, how can we, this user is trying to learn something. How can we guide them on this learning journey and in this discussion and this conversation, achieve their learning objective and evidence the beliefs that they're looking for?
Yes. Yeah, totally. So our thinking here that's different than most evals tools is that if we start with the belief systems like we do with Epistemic Me, if we combine everything from our knowledge of neuroscience and philosophy and epistemology of like how a person discerns truth and knowledge, and that goes into updating their belief systems, as well as concepts of the free energy principle, et cetera, feeding our recommendation engine, we could really make, in this example, AI Brian that we're working with Don't Die with, we could really make AI Brian smarter, and AI Brian's knowledge of the user in question. Let's say I'm the user, I want to improve my sleep in some way, and go to AI Brian. AI Brian has to have a really good model and definition of who I am and what my beliefs are to be able to best help me. And so our differentiator with these evals tools, and Jonathan, please feel free to add on, is really these belief maps and these visualizations like our personalization metrics, and then helping the developer get this agent smarter and increase the learning of the user. So doing that in a very holistic way that drives hyper personalization, like this agent through all these tools in this dialectic trainer and the developer SDK Playground should be able to create a more efficacious chatbot agent for their particular use case. So anything else you want to talk through on this screen in particular, Jonathan?
Yeah, as an evaluation dashboard, it's trying to pull in the conversations. And you can see, I like this state that each conversation can be in. So you can review this and mark it as reviewed, or you could mark it as edited or something like that. I think some of the icons on the bottom, or if you click on them, they allow you to make a comment. Yeah, and so this
Yeah.
idea that you could have domain experts or come in and make comments so that you can, as an engineer, you can understand like, oh, this is what the domain experts are saying. Let me update the prompt or the documents available so that it passes this.
Yeah. So
Um,
so just to expound on that case a little bit, let's say you are creating a health or longevity focused AI coach or agent. Then let's say you have real health or longevity human coaches. They would do this screen and they could look at these conversation turns or dialectics. I'm using those as synonyms, and actually add in their own notes on these. So you, as the engineering team or development team, could get annotated conversations and dialectics from the domain experts, which we've found in industry best practice to make the best chatbots. That's actually how you make the best chatbots is you have domain experts for the particular vertical you're going after, whether it be health, longevity, finance, education, in particular domain or whatever. You have those experts and you lower, minimize the feedback loop of the conversation turns with the chatbot, and then getting the experts evaluations and annotating which ones are good or bad. And then that improves the training and the evals. So in this UX or UI, that's what we're going for with this is you as the development team could help facilitate your experts to go in here and self-service, help you annotate and make your agent better. Cool. Anything else on this screen to call out, Jonathan?
yeah, that's a good overview. And I think if we back out a little bit, there's a conversational data set that underlies this. And so that's where you're going to keep like your golden conversations that indicate what the agent should do. But it's also where you can pull in new conversations that you had with your users in your app, and you can evaluate them to see if they actually pass the evaluation metrics. And I think the user
Yeah,
workbench is maybe an interesting place to go next.
cool. Let's go to the user workbench. Select the
So
user.
the Yeah, because the idea with Epistemic Me is that you can take your agent and you can profile it against different characteristics of users, specifically users that have their own belief system structures. And so these were a couple different archetypes. We have the biohacker pro, the busy parent, fitness enthusiast. And this, so the idea is that you can take a synthetic user archetype, run it against your agent, and then simulate and create those conversations that we just looked at there.
Mhm.
And so you might find that, oh yeah, my agent does really well with these types of users, but for this type of user, it doesn't do so good, and you might need to make updates to the agent accordingly.
Very
So
cool.
yeah, this is a screen to build the synthetic user basically, and then run the simulation.
Yeah, super sick. Yeah, I guess it might be worthwhile to throw in there. We're thinking of building all of this API first, and that way, we enable a future where a developer, I imagine, could come to an epistemic agent that kind of does the orchestration of all this for you, and we could report it in Slack. I'll caveat, we're nowhere near that, but I'd like to get there someday. Like we're really obsessing over how could we make it as easy as possible for any developer, and then in the future, maybe even not a developer, but for right now, a developer, any developer to create the best in-class agent for their particular use case. And right now, focusing on health longevity. Anywhere I should click around in here in the user workbench, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think you get the idea. You can put in different characteristics as a user profile, but then there's the philosophies area there. If you scroll, yeah, and there's, and I don't know if we'll go to it, but those are
Here,
come from the philosophies workbench. And
yeah,
the idea
I
is that
see.
you can generate a philosophy and associate with a user archetype. And a user archetype could have a whole bunch of different philosophies that you associate with it. Um,
Yeah, this
and
one's a
this
good
is where I
call
think,
out. Sorry,
go ahead,
Jonathan, go ahead. I think you were going to say what I was going to say.
I go for it. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say this one's a good call out, like for the Biohacker Pro. Like we've set it up with some dummy data here, but going under their philosophies, I clicked inspect philosophy for sleep optimization, and you could see kind of how our data model works. Like you can go to belief systems, you could see, oh, sleep quality is more important than quantity. Cool. And then you could see the confidence interval we have on that particular belief. And then you could also see the nested functionality here. So that's so cool to see. And then if I click that, okay, this is coming soon, or the connection to this, but yeah, I can go to the Philosopher's Workbench and actually work on that there. Should we do that actually? Should we go to the Philosopher's Workbench?
Sure, it's a nice placeholder.
Yeah.
And yeah, I ideally would have had a sample philosophy here, and you could paste it in and then look at the update on the right-hand side. So this is the split plane view. And I think this is where we come back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, like in terms of how do we model the experience, right? How do we model
Yeah.
consciousness or consciousness as experience? And we use this concept called observation context. And so when when we the idea is to put in a philosophy as a sort of experiential narrative. You're trying to describe, how a fitness enthusiast goes through their day, what they're sort of like seeing and experiencing, what kind of causal patterns they see, and I think effectively this comes down to habits. I think is a most like a pragmatic way to model. If we have a fitness enthusiast, if we could walk through a day of their habits, and we could articulate, and this the word philosophy is actually modifying how the user is seeing the world and how the user is applying concepts of causality to the world. And so we want to understand that. Want to understand the habits that they have, what are the underlying beliefs behind those habits, both in actuating them and why they have them. And ultimately, we want to help the user become a different version of themselves by updating their habits towards what they want to become. So yeah, we'll be creating the first philosophies in here and create the first, sample users. But the idea is that an experiential narrative can be used as like a strong data format, to like associate with the users and to create synthetic users and to modify real users in the real world in that vein. And um, so what the experiential narrative as a philosophy does is it gives us we like a nested tree of observation contexts that all have a probabilistic state within them. And then when we say the user wants to evidence a belief, we can kind of like traverse that nested tree, find the evidence of the beliefs that they're evidencing right now, provide evidence in that context, and then like basically help the user along their learning journey through this lens.
Sweet. Yeah, and Jonathan and I actually spent a couple hours, and probably Jonathan spent many more hours thinking this through of what this could look like. But what we want the developer to be able to do is go to this and just talk in natural language about that experiential narrative for the user. And then we should be able to, in real time, see what the SDK does to break this down from a model point of view. Like what are the actual data structures and what do they look like with populated data? And in this way, you can kind of see your belief systems and those observation contexts for the philosophy for that user, which will be pretty cool. So we'll be working on this. We'll have an update on this next time. But I think this is going to be a really cool one where the user, like the developer, gets like immediate feedback. They might have, actually, now that I think about it, we might have like on our website, we probably should have some sample experiential narratives that are just like click a button, auto populate with a
Yeah, that's
standard,
a really good idea.
the biohacker one or the I'm a busy parent but want to stay healthy one. And then they could actually see how these break up and that would more tie their information architecture for their current user base, especially for our first focus, the health and longevity development teams. Cool. So
Yeah.
we just did that live. That's going to go in the backlog.
And
um,
and by the way, I think with our target AI health coach, I think
yeah,
we'll be bootstrapping some sample philosophies there, try to show the utility of it, and then working with the teams don't die to understand how they want to profile the users and like how they really want to use these philosophies. And we'll probably have to do some hand holding there to, standardize the language and that kind of thing.
I think
But
so.
I think
Yeah,
the construct should be flexible enough that as long as there's a phenomenological representation of the user, and that's ultimately the most predictive one we can get to, like then you can use any number of philosophies to kind of like modify that. So it'd be really cool to kind of get into some cases and get these like to work specifically on those philosophies with customers.
yeah, and just for the audience, because me and Jonathan are in it, and we use these words all the time. So for you to know what we mean by swapping out philosophies for an agent, it's kind of like every longevity influencer, doctor, researcher, whatever, has their own strategy for longevity. Peter Attia wants to maximize health span and lifespan. The don't die philosophy is more around being immortal and staying alive long enough for advanced longevity treatments to become immortal. And then there's everything in between, right? There's also like YOLO lifestyle philosophy that probably is not going to go in your health longevity agent, but it could. It probably would be a bad app, but don't do that. But it could. Like that could be like the people living out in the real world, like that go to bars and don't care about their sleep and don't exercise. Like they're living the YOLO sort of philosophy, right? So we're Jonathan is just simply saying the agents will be flexible enough to I'm sorry, I should say the SDK will be flexible enough for you to implement different philosophies for your users. Cool. Okay. Anything else on the philosopher's workbench and sort of our vision for that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. We talked about the philosophy workbench. You create philosophies, then you can use those with synthetic users to attach those philosophies to the user. That gives guidance to how the synthetic user will answer a question or ask a question in a conversation. And then you want to simulate a set of conversations between a synthetic user and your agent, and then evaluate them and make sure that it's behaving the way you expect. And we provide some personalization metrics that that you can evaluate those with.
Cool. I was just clicking these other links and just seeing if we have implemented this live, and we haven't yet linked these
Yeah.
pages. Cool. Okay. So I know you've been putting a lot of work into iterating on the prototype. Where are we at with the back end now that, well, actually, have we finished everything we want to talk through around the front end before we get into back end?
Yeah, I think there's a good overview of the design target. Yeah. And
Okay,
so then the
sweet.
question came up of like, how should we integrate agents? What kind of user experience should we create to integrate agents?
Cool. And real quick, For the audience, if you're a chatbot developer that is interested on getting on the wait list for our SDK, we're hoping, by the time this podcast, I think it'll come out in a couple of weeks, SDK hopefully will be above the surface MVP wise in June 2025 of this video creation. So if it's not, email us. Not a hard promise, by the way, but hit us up if you want to be on the wait list. If you're interested in building with us, you're interested in making your chatbots better. That's what we're obsessed with, is doing just that and solving hyper personalization for you. So definitely hit us up. And if you see anything on that front end that you're interested in, maybe you are a developer and you're like, oh, actually, Robert, I would totally love using it in this kind of way, or you should think about this workflow. We want to hear it from you. So please hit us up. All right, Jonathan, want to take us through some of the backend updates?
Yeah, so I'm going to run a script for you where I've created an agent on Amazon Bedrock, and it's it's going to run through the script, and it'll first it fetches the agent from AWS. Then it creates an agent to agent card. This is a specific format from Google that is a definition of an agent, and I found it like to be really helpful to create like a normalization layer so that we can pull these agents from a LangGraph or from AWS Bedrock or wherever. Um, then it launches a Flask server that like provisions that agent definition, and then it proceeds to run creates a synthetic conversation, and then runs evaluations on it. Then it will like suggest changes. So what we're looking at here is a recent run that I did. So here's the evaluation results right here, right? And these are the scores. We were just looking at those in the front end, right? And then it gives reasons for like why the score was the way it was. And
Wait,
it
let's
looks
pause there
like,
real quick, because I think that's a really important one, just for the audience to tie through. As the developer, this is the data for running these conversation turns and simulating them. So like that sentence in particular, user identification for the personalization metrics, I think that's such a good one. Could you pause there real quick?
oh, which one?
Yeah, right, just right there.
Yeah.
So that right there, that reasons structure that has user identification and the conversation lacks any information about the user's cohort membership characteristics or unique identifiers, making it impossible to assess a demographic or psychographic profiles. So this is like the lift that our SDK does. I guess I just really want to hammer that home for the audience. Like that processing is what we do well. So yeah, keep going, Jonathan. I just wanted to really hammer that point home.
Yeah. And using DeepEval, which is an open source evaluation framework, to do that and putting custom conversational G-evals for our personalization metrics. And so that's how these reasons kind of come to be. I'm noticing this last run that I did, I might have regressed it where it's not actually having real conversations. It's like defaulting to some, these are,
This
yeah, these are some examples of
software
a real,
talking to itself, or
yeah, it is. These are some examples where it generated like a real agent. And some of the conversations were fun to read. So
wait, yeah,
each user,
let's go through one.
sure, let me go to the top of this. Say, hello, I'm looking to get together some reliable information on managing hypertension and type 2 diabetes. Could you point me towards some credible resources, recent studies that might help me improve my lifestyle? And then the agent is saying, could you please specify which aspects of managing hypertension, type 2 diabetes are most interesting to you? For example, diet, exercise, and medication, etc. And then we have the score here of like where we're at. And these are pretty low scores. Like it doesn't really know much about the user at this point. And then it gives some reasons of where's that. But
You know,
then
real
go
quick,
ahead.
Jonathan, I'm kind of curious, like how now I'm thinking about the developer's experience, right? Like, how will they know what's a good score or a bad score? Maybe
Yeah,
silly
we can set
question, but
thresholds. And I think the more data that we get about like these personalization metrics, the more like we'll be able to give like default thresholds that are helpful.
oh, okay.
But
But is
yeah,
there
I
any
think
meaning? Is there any meaning for the range of this? You know, is there a max or
yeah, well, they go 0 to 1.
okay? All right, yeah,
Yeah,
that
so
was the
this one's actually pretty high right here. It's almost 90%. Let's see what it
yeah.
says.
I see.
Uh, yeah, this output aligns with the user's belief in dietary and exercise management and their conditions, introduces new concepts like the DASH and Mediterranean diets, addresses potential cognitive dissidence by acknowledging individual variability, and provides credible evidence by referencing research and recommending professional consultation. So that's pretty cool. It felt the evaluation tool felt like the agent did a good job of giving evidence to the user that matched their beliefs.
Hmm. Yeah, sweet. So yeah, basically like this is the data, and then imagine that in the sick UX we were showing you earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's how these
that's super
pieces are
cool.
coming together. Yeah.
That's really
Uh,
great.
Yeah, and the last thing I was working on here was that it could take those explanations about, why a metric was good or bad, and then it would. This is a recommended prompt, so new suggested new instruction, and it's supposed to do a diff here. I'm working on that. Like it's supposed to diff, but it writes
Oh,
out like what the prompt should be versus like what it is now.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and I noticed it made some pretty specific changes, including like asking it to act like expert in one of the versions I did. Um,
Cool.
and
Very
yeah,
cool.
and then it saves it back to Bedrock. So you can run this and then just kind of hit deploy or put it to a new alias and test it live on the server. And you know, so this I think this kind of evaluation loop can be very fluid.
Yeah. So we go like full 360, right? To improve. Don't gotta, they'll just update in Bedrock. Someday it'll just be straight notification to your brain, not in Slack either.
Right. Well, yeah, I wanted your thoughts on the user interface for this because there's you can think about a dashboard. We would do this in the same UI we're just looking at, and you could pull in your agent. That means putting in like your AWS credentials or this kind of thing, and then you could run a simulation with that agent, and then see it on our dashboard, and then hit another button that would say deploy, which would sort of like take look. You can see in our evaluation dashboard the conversations you just generated. Then we could recommend changes to it. You could accept those recommendations and then redeploy it. So we could do all of that within like the dashboard that we were just looking at, if that's kind of like a good user experience paradigm. But I want to leave like a lot of sort of optionality in the editing phase where like they can get into evaluation, they can see auto recommended changes, but then they can also invite domain experts in to like, review those conversations,
Yeah.
then make the updates again.
Yeah. You know, what I'm kind of thinking is usually a development team is going to have, I mean, depending on the maturity, but let's say they're like past product market fit and they have users, they have alpha users, they have, you know, CI/CD set up where they could stage releases, they have lower environments, they have higher environments, they have production, right? And so it'd be sick if for a development team that's already set up with all of that, that already has a user group that is, in some Slack somewhere that the development team has put together, and then they give them a link to experimental builds or alpha builds. It'd be sweet if this does the 360 round trip of, oh, I got some feedback from my users. Great. The experts are already in there. They've seen the user conversations. We've annotated which ones. We have some user data. We have experts inputting which ones are good or bad. We run a bunch of simulations, and then now we have another data set, and we want to deploy an update to that lower
Mhm.
environment, and then immediately users get to test it. So, and then at a certain threshold, I'd love to be able to promote that to a higher environment. So I think that's what a typical development team would like is, let me deploy some changes to a lower environment, get real humans that are my users testing that in alpha, and then an automated way to track when this is good enough to then auto deploy to a higher environment and then eventually make it to production.
Cool.
Is that how
Yeah.
you're thinking of it as well?
Yeah, I think I'm just trying to picture like the release process for that, because I
Yeah.
think, like you said, right now it just uses kind of like a staging alias to save a version back, and then you'd have to like manually promote it to be the production one on Bedrock. But I'm wondering, like, let's say you run an experiment with a cohort of 20 users or something like that. And so you have some already you have some synthetic conversations that are already there, and then you go and test this in the wild with some real users, and you expand the data set collection, and then what will be the process for review that we want to meet as like kind of a best practice, during the release cycle? Is it just the developer going to take some of these conversations and say, oh, there's some obvious errors here. Let me just fix these and redeploy it really quick. Or are we going to accommodate, like a broader set of domain experts who could be health coaches or doctors that are going to review it and leave kind of like a multi-stage window of approval? Or do we just assume there's kind of like a release meeting and, okay, here's the conversations. Let's go through them one by one. We'll take an hour to do it. And then at the end, we would just want to update the instructions and redeploy. Yeah, I think that course we're taking will give some insights into
Yeah.
how different teams are doing this too.
You know what's interesting is my answer without reading any of the internet for this is it depends how rich and mature the team is. that's
Yeah,
that's
right.
probably like the best thing is do what the experts say to do, which is have self-service for experts to annotate and then have process around that. And so like depending on the size of the team, do they have experts? Do they have great process? Or are they just trying to ship? Like I basically to be inclusive, I think it's enable all those cases. And then I think it's going to be a range, like I said, of how mature the team is and how much PMF they found or what stage of their business they're in if they're scaling. I would say where our current customer is at, maybe just the first one is good.
Hmm.
And then the third one, they'd be more set up for than the second one, which is like integrate domain experts and stuff. But I do think we want to gear them towards two, which is like holy grail continuous improvement, right? So
Yeah.
so I'd say we should have
Cool.
the flexibility to override number two and go one or three. I imagine that would be the same tooling. And then have some settings for them to implement a workflow with some approval step. I
Yeah.
gotta sit down and think through what the approval workflow would look like. It honestly, just because I've worked in enterprise software, typically these workflows are very dependent business to business. And
Hmm.
just like how they set up workflows is going to be dependent business to business. Like even things like what's their source of truth for user IDs is like another thing. And then I mean you can get pretty advanced. Like for example, a really big team that has lots of agents, they might have workflows by roles. So let's say there's a role that has a lot of real people in the role, like the role, let's say it's what's that one longevity clinic that Lynn works at?
Found life.
Fountain Life. Yeah. So let's say you're Fountain Life. You have a role for health coaches like Lynn and maybe 100 other health coaches or longevity coaches. And then you have maybe 5 or 10 agents across Fountain Life to go like help clients. Let's just say that this is a thing. And then you have 100 health coaches. And then you say, hey, all health coaches, you have to spend 1 hour a week annotating this thing. So on the back end, the admin would have to set up, like the IT person would have to set up, hey, for this security role, it's these 100 people, these are the user IDs, and then only they get access to agent one or agent two or agent three or agent four or agent five, because maybe some people have specialization with certain agents with skill sets, whatever. Or maybe it's even like a thing where it's like mental health practitioners only need to be certified for this to be able to annotate. I could see that being a use case. So they have to have that audit trail or compliance. Okay, so that's one is I could see like enterprise level being that level where it's like a user left the company, but that doesn't mean we have to go reconfigure the admin settings. It's tied to a role. I could see another thing where it's okay, so now we've set up this workflow where the role of a developer, I don't know, issues something, clicks a button, and then it's like, hey, new set of annotations needed. And then it
Hmm.
triggers a notification to the workflow of whoever owns the role of a coach. And it hits an email notification say, hey, you got to go in to this link and annotate some stuff now. They go in, they annotate some stuff. Developer gets a notification. Great, it looks done. Cool. Click button to run the simulations, get the latest data set. That's like super high level me spitballing what this might look like for a more complex case. So yeah, in that case, then I suppose it could get pretty complicated if we said you need a no code, low code workflow builder that helps me orchestrate email notifications and stuff like that. And then another thing there was like, okay, we need access management and identity management lightweight with some level of security for encapsulating the APIs needed to read or write these conversations by a certain role tied to a certain user. Okay, so that's a lot of shit,
Yeah.
but we'll
Well,
take the transcript and
well,
just take our intern and create some stories from that.
cool. Well, I mean, I think we'll learn the fastest with indie developers and startups, right? I mean, just the pure amount of bureaucracy to meet for feature
Yeah,
parity and evaluation tools in enterprise, I think would like block us from getting to the heart of the learning, which is like how do we
for
make
sure.
better user profiles?
So yeah, to go back to it though, that's like future enterprise ready. In the beginning, it's probably just gonna be Greg and just doing this himself. So
Yeah. That's where I'm
that's
really trying
guiding.
to imagine success is that and like what the user experience is for the indie developer or the developer on a startup team. But like Greg also has to be responsible for some domain expertise and because the chatbot has knowledge bases, he needs to
Yeah.
make sure that it's pulling those knowledge bases into place at the right time. And there's probably
Mm.
going to be some level of review at some point that we need to accommodate. So I was thinking about that.
I could see
But
legal and maybe the uh, in-house medical staff. Like I could see
Mhm.
them being part of the review process. At this point in time, I don't see them standing up the sanitation process soon, but I think that should be a target for us. We should be telling them, hey, that's best practice and that's where we should be going. But in the alpha beta stages, probably not necessary, but in production, necessary. I'd say that's how we should play this.
okay. Well, and there's
Yeah.
another thing that maybe even invalidates this whole part of the review process, which is that LLM is a judge, and you could like have in your evaluation metrics act like a legal compliance officer at a
Yeah.
medical startup, right?
Yeah.
And have it evaluate each of the conversations and give a response. And that might actually take care of, say, the 70-80% cases. And there's
I think that
actually, I think
would.
there's a debate in the evaluation community about whether LLM is a judge, like how far can it go, where should it be used, versus having the domain experts like fix the prompts and what's actually valuable for making the experience good.
My gut feel based on what I read is LMS judge gets the 70-80 like Pareto, and we'll have to go earn those hard-earned secrets once we get into the weeds. That's what I'm thinking. And our next iterations will probably be based on those like very real couple hundred users like using AI Brian. Let's just go with case
Cool.
one for now as the TLDR on that. And then let's just learn more. But then I have this, but just because I've worked in so much enterprise software, like I have pretty good vision of what the premium features would be. I think for a bigger company wanting to use this, those would be all the things they would need. Like
I don't
all
disagree. Yeah.
yeah, those enterprise features, workflow builders, security, access management, identity, that kind of stuff.
Like we'll probably
Okay,
need a few dozen startups and indie customers before like we know we have a good value proposition to go into enterprise with.
absolutely. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Let me share this output again. I just run like the last script without the right parameter, but this is with the actual chat logs and it has reasons for updating each one. And this is pretty cool. And so it takes all these reasons and it feeds it in to create this like new
Oh, the
prompt
new
right
prompt?
here. Yeah.
Oh, that's sweet. So just to explain for people that are maybe only listening, we're showing console logs of the output of one of these simulations and what the agent's learning is. And so we get an input from a simulated user, we get an output from the agent in response to that input. And then we see what the actual evals come back with. And what we're seeing on the screen is the process of that simulation, and the output will be, hey, based on all these simulations, here's what the new prompt should look like. So we have an auto like fine tune prompt feature for you, which is really cool. And you can kind of trace that through the stack of simulations. That's so sweet. Dude, this is so sick. I can't wait
Yeah.
to see this hooked up to our front end and see this all flow through. So the Bedrock 360 is already going?
Yeah. Let me see if I
Cool.
can get there. Yeah, so this actually just saved back the new version on Bedrock, and then you come here. This is my agent to evidence self-police, and we
Oh, sweet.
just saved version 4 right there.
Sweet. That's so cool.
Yeah, and see, it updated the instructions versus what it was before.
Oh, very
Uh,
cool.
so yeah, so that's cool. And as an intermediary task, it translated like the new prompt into the definition in the A to A format, the
Mhm.
Google's agent to agent format. So
Yeah,
like again, each agent has a card that like represents their set of capabilities, including like the prompts they use, the tools they use, the resources. And so what that script I just showed did is like, it ran the evaluation, it created a new instruction prompt, it created an A to A card that had a definition of the agent, and then it synced that back as a new version on Bedrock that's ready to deploy. Um, so
is the
that's kind of
card
cool.
tied to the multiple versions?
Yeah. So
Okay, cool.
the yeah,
Yeah,
you can think
that's
of it
sick.
like anybody who builds an agent on our platform will have a card in the registry. I think
Yeah,
this comes back to some of the networked agents ideas that we have.
yeah,
But yeah, the A2A protocol is really cool, and it offers like maybe the only full like description of an agent that I had that I could find that could be like used on any different could be used on LangGraph or AWS Bedrock or whatever you want to build your agent in. It could have an agent card representation in A2A, and we
cool.
can just store like a library of those so we know like where to route
Yeah,
users based on the scores that these agent cards have scored on their evaluation tools.
that's super sick. Yeah, and just
Yeah.
to expound on like why this matters is we see if you we've talked about this and just for the pod audience, you maybe you've already heard this from us, but we see a future where networked agents, this whole agent to agent protocol that came out from Google that will enable agentic, what I see is agentic marketplaces in the future. I think that's so obviously going to happen. A good example of this is any like health influencer, longevity influencer, they have a certain skill set. And then to get a one-on-one coaching session with them, like Seam Land or whatever, I think he had thousands of dollars to get a one-on-one coaching session with them. So he's built up, probably decade plus expertise in this domain, this niche domain. And to get that expertise is a consult with him, right? It's a really expensive consult. So obviously only the privileged can get it. I see a future with AI scaling expertise like that. So imagine you're an enterprise, you want to get Seamland's expertise, like you're 100 different businesses that want to maybe get his expertise, I don't know, flowing into your organization for your employees' well-being or whatever. What if he had just had an agent that could do that work for you? You know, it's going to be different if you're looking for like an in-person speech or some sort of speaking event. But what if you had a Seamland approved agent and you could just borrow that agent's time to create things for your employees? Or even in the future, I bet we could, with video creation AI tools, we could take his self model, create videos specific to your environment, maybe in your language, but with his avatar. So I see a future where Seam just like turns on this agent, him, and then it just goes and makes money by being rented out, bidded for, selling SKUs or whatever. And then a corporate enterprise could go to a marketplace, an agentic marketplace ran by Epistemic Me, look for longevity wellness coaches and look for that particular expertise. It's like, cool, I want to click this. Great. I get billed on my token usage or API usage. And then I'm in there and I can see experts from lots of different domains who have their own agents. And I'd like to be able to bring in that expertise or those skill sets into my environment. So I see a future where this agentic marketplace thing will be real, and whoever builds the matchmaking that guarantees the best matchmaking for that, which I think we will, is going to be in a great position to help facilitate some of this expertise exchange for capital, right? And maybe even someday it gets into, hey, if I use your agent, you could use my agent for a bit. Like maybe we discount each other and usage or just trade usage. I could see that happening. So I know we're getting to time, and I wanted to just tee off that question, just future looking, forward looking. Jonathan, what do you think about agentic marketplaces? We've been talking about that a lot.
Yeah, I guess just really concretely, we just demonstrated this evaluation of a particular user cohort with a specific intent. And what we're validating is that the agent can be helpful in answering the questions, helping them learn. And so you get a score for that. And so if you have an agent on a marketplace that has been validated to be helpful to a certain user cohort, it's kind of like a credential in a sense, right? And then like we would know, but anybody would know that, hey, we can route somebody to that agent and they'll be helpful to this user in this context. And that's, I think, like where the matchmaking power comes in. It's, you know, it's it's very sort of concrete, following like the agent to cohort training we were just doing.
Totally. And another thing, real quick, it's as a founder today, if you're going to go run paid ads, you have to have a really good definition of your ICP, or you're still testing at that point before you go turn on the money engine to get in front of the right eyeballs, right? So just in the future, we're kind of saying, Facebook, Google, their ads campaign managers allows you to go to certain heuristics or cohorts. Like what we're hoping to build with Epistemic Me is we have this down to mathematical scores of did this agent help this intent / this cohort, right? So then that's the level of matchmaking we'd like to get to and enable. So I think that at the belief level will be very powerful. Okay, we're almost at 2 hours now. I need to get towards winding down. Anything else you want to say about the SDK Playground or consciousness, Jonathan, before we round out the podcast?
Yeah, a lot more to say. I think that's a good wrap for today. Yeah, I think I'd love to go sometime into more depth about the structure of the observation context and how it like really utilizes phenomenological philosophy to create a representation of self. I think it's just there's probably a deep dive there, but I think we
We'll
touched
do
on some
that.
stuff around the surface. That's really cool.
We'll do that next time. So if you're interested in doing a deep dive with us on the observation context, it's a core part of our data model and what will hopefully save the world in the future. We'll expound more on that. Why? Next time. Jonathan will love to talk about the observation context. I think it's such a cool idea. So please tune in to next episode. We'll do a deeper dive on that, on the back end, our implementation of that and the philosophy of the concept of observation context. Thanks everybody for watching ABCs for Building the Future or listening to it. We will catch you next time. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.